A good way to understand neurodivergence is spiky profiles. So, a generalized explanation might look like this. The majority of people seem to be average at a lot of things, but ND folk are excellent in some areas and then struggle in other areas, creating a very spiky profile. But we can look deeper and look at what our society values, because in reality, every person has a somewhat spiky profile. So why do our spiky profiles matter so much or stand out so much? Well, we live in a world that values some human traits, actions, and ways more than others. Excelling at communicating honestly, for example, like many of us neurodivergent folk do, has no value in a world that values dishonesty. Having an egalitarian outlook is common amongst us ND people, but then the world values hierarchy, linking obviously back to valuing lying. We can't live in a hierarchy without lying about some humans being better, more important, and more valuable than others. Some neurodivergent people don't make mouth sounds, and we live in a world that places speech above all other communication for some odd reason. Many of us hyper-focus and become experts in a world that champions the average, while also strangely platforming experts, almost like it's part of the facade. No, we really value uniqueness. Look, here's a few unique people who are really important. Now the rest of you can go back to being average, please. A cunning illusion. But many of us see the emperor has no clothes and also has no right to be emperor. Our wild creativity is also not very much appreciated in our education systems and workplaces. We are a creative people living in a world that values conformity. Our world demands compliance, and we're super talented at non-compliance. We could go on, and it's similar to when we talk about like strengths and weaknesses, because they're highly subjective notions, they're context dependent, and are often assumed by those at the higher levels of this pretend hierarchy, those experts again. It's just easier for some spiky profiles not to matter in our world. For example, it doesn't really matter if you can't play football in many instances. And yes, there are places where it would be seen as a terrible thing not to play football. But imagine a world where that values football playing as much as we do speech, for example. Something that everyone has to do or else they're deemed a failed human. Well, we'd have support groups for parents of non-footballing children, courses on how to employ non-footballing adults, sibling support for those whose siblings are inflicted with the disordered football deficits. We'd have criteria, obviously, to diagnose those of us who maybe, with the right help and accommodations, might someday play football like the normal people. We'd be high-functioning non-footballers. Not quite footballers, but almost there, you see. Passing as footballers. Almost. And then the criteria, of course, would be rigid. So it would have levels of impairment. Those of us deemed in childhood to be unteachable will need to be segregated from the others, even the other non-footballers. But they'd learn life skills because their ability to play football is directly linked to their ability to do everything else, apparently. Ironically, spiky profiles don't seem to exist for this cohort of humans at all. There'd be studies linking IQ, another test that pretends to prove something, with non-footballing levels of deficit. They'd have developed better tools after moving on from measuring our heads and the distance between our big toe and our little toe. Then there would be therapies to try to support non-footballers to fit in and build resilience to the mocking, shaming, othering, and physical segregation. Professionals would go on to link high levels of anxiety, low self-esteem, and depression with being a non-footballer and assuming it's just a natural part of being a non-footballer. There would be special diets for non-footballers to help them with the symptoms of non-footballing. Some dodgy thinkers would blame the vaccines for the existence of non-footballers instead of addressing their own prejudice. We'd have schools for footballers and special schools for non-footballers. We might include the footballers or the non-footballers, though, by adding separate units onto the footballing schools. A new notion of segregated inclusion would begin. Tons of money would go into researching the phenomenon of non-footballing. Particular attention will be paid to people with wombs. What happens in the womb and the connection that parent has with their child? People without wombs are already exempt, you see, because, the world is built on lies and hierarchy. Charities would spring up everywhere to research causes, warn people about us, especially parents. There'd be media notice warnings of red flags for non-footballing kids and lists of early interventions to interrupt your non-footballing child's natural development. They'd collect money on our behalf while many of us live in poverty and take our own lives. The behaviourists would get involved. That goes without saying, with their ABA and PBS to support us when we might try and express any sort of frustration at the way we're being treated. Or, heaven forbid, just live our lives as non-footballers. We'd have behaviour support needs, you see, because someone made that up as a thing. People would post on their Facebook feed, "I love someone with non-footballing." And then someone would comment saying it's actually a non-footballing person. Others would argue too about the language they use to describe us, instead of wondering why there is an us. Those who try to draw attention to the fact that non-footballers are human and have rights would be called extremists. We'd offer all kinds of insight and explanations as to why segregating us, pathologizing us, and dehumanizing us is wrong, but much of it would be dismissed as misinformed or radicalism. People would say, when you've met one non-footballer, then you've met one non-footballer. And then, as if that somehow wasn't dehumanizing, but a revelatory comment instead. People who are susceptible to conspiracy would stop vaccinating their kids because risking your kid's life is better than having a non-footballing child. The papers would be filled with stories of parents at their wits' end from their non-footballing kids and their challenging behaviour caused by the deficits in footballing. There would be people queuing up for therapies for non-footballers. It sounds ridiculous, right? And yet, this is the world we live in. This is the world so many believe in. Our spiky profiles only matter because we're thinkers in a world that encourages us not to think. We are self-teachers in a world that discourages questioning. We're often highly talented in an area that's regarded as weird or useless. Our hyper-focus and interest-led existence has no place in a world that demands multitaskers. We are sensitive in a world that views sensitivity as a weakness, a disorder even. Maybe spiky profiles are just a human thing, but some spikes matter more than others. So much so that some spiky profiles appear quite flat. Unless, of course, someone changes the rules. We're human. Having spiky profiles is natural, and our survival depends on it. No one person has everything to sustain themselves, let alone a community. We are interdependent. The notion of independence is directly linked to the notion of the average all-rounder. These lies distance each of us from the other. It's okay to admit we're not self-sufficient, that we need to rely on each other. And as soon as we do that, then we'll start to ignore the value systems imposed on us, the idea of competition, and realise that the only way of winning this game is to collaborate, to rely, to seek help, to revel in our humanity and see that we're all different anyway. We've just created a system that values some differences and magnifies others.